Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about plans and mini plans and show you a game from a famous planning book. A lot of people play chess and they think at all times during the game you need to have this long-term plan, like for the next 30 moves, first I'm going to push my kingside pawns, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that, then I'm going to sacrifice my knight, and if everything works out, then I can bring my rook up and, 40 moves from now I'll have a mating attack. That's not the way chess is generally played. In his wonderful but very advanced book, Secrets of Modern Chess Strategy, International Master John Watson talked more about mini plans, that it's much more likely that you're doing things in the short term than the long term. It's not that there's not some positions, like maybe some very static endgame positions where you can't figure out 20 moves ahead what's going to happen. But that's not normally the case. So what Watson suggested, and what I also agree on, is that normally you have these little mini plans. Like in the opening, a typical mini plan might be, which is the next piece I need to develop, and where does he need to go, and how do I need to get him there as soon as possible? That kind of thing. Or my king needs to castle. I could castle on either side. Which pieces do I want to bring out first so that I can castle on that side and get my king out of the middle as fast as possible? Little mini plans. Another mini plan might be, I see he has a weak square on d4. If I can get rid of his bishop that's guarding d4 and then stick my knight on c6, I can go up to d4 and he won't have any pieces to take it, and I'll have a good outpost knight on d4. That's a good example of like a mini plan. Now, one of the most famous planning books ever is Judgment and Planning in Chess by World Champion Max Euwe. Dr. Euwe was a math professor and, of course, world champion before World War II. And in this book, he talks a lot about planning. And he gives an example from one of his games here, looking at the back of the book called Illustrative Games, where he gives a game that he won against Dr. Krakauer in 1948. So I'd like to go over the game and talk to you about what Max Euwe said. And also, we have an interesting insight in that today we have engines that can give us better evaluations than what people could before they had these tremendous tools. So we can actually make a comment on Dr. Euwe's comments. And during this game, he stops 4 different times and talks about a little mini plan that Black will have in the next few moves, since he was playing Black. And we'll stop and do that, and we'll actually talk about, how reasonable that is. All right, so the game opens up Ruy Lopez. Let me click on the moves here. We're using our Lichess board. All right, so we have a Gioco Piano, bishop c4. Well, Italian game, bishop c4. Gioco Piano, bishop c5. Today, grandmasters either play d3 or castle, or maybe c3 and then d3 and castle. They play c3, the old move. Now, the main move here in modern chess is knight to f6, so that if d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4 check gets into all the old lines that grandmasters now avoid. If you've never seen that before, I'll just show you real quickly. You want to study this because people will play this against you. And now after knight c3, you would play something like knight takes e4, castle, knight takes, pawn takes, and now the important move d5. But that's not part of today's game. That's just showing you a very important line to know. So in the game, Dr. Euwe did not play knight f6. He simply played bishop to b6. White played d4. Black plays queen e7 to guard the e-pawn. White castles. Black plays d6. White plays h3 to stop bishop g4. Black plays knight f6. And now we've transposed into a lot of games in the Lichess Master database. There's now 40 games with this position. It looks a lot like a Ruy Lopez, except that White hasn't put his bishop on b5 and Black hasn't played a6. But the rest of the setup is very much like more like a Ruy Lopez. All right, so White plays rook e1. Black plays castles. And we now have 19 games in the database. And the engine has White as ahead by about 0.7 pawns, which is a pretty big opening advantage for White. And this is the first part of the game where Euwe gives some mini plans. So let's read what he says in the book, Judgment and Planning in Chess. He says, after black plays castles, the assessment of the position is white's position in the center is more aggressive, but he can hardly benefit from this fact because black can force him to give up his strong pivot at e5. That's not quite true because white has a nice advantage at 0.7, so his advantage is a little bit more than what Dr. Euwe intimates. The plan for white is to put his knight on c4 where the bishop currently is, laying stress if occasional arises on a tactical point due to the immobility of black's bishop on b6. But he must be prepared to switch over to another course by bringing his knight to d5 via maybe e3 or via c4 and then e3. Okay, so he's actually talking more about what white's plan is here than black's plan, even though he's playing black. All right, so the game continued with white playing knight a3. The database shows that a4 is the most commonly played move, and a4 ties for the best move with b4 in the engine's analysis. So white plays knight a3, but he still retains a 0.6 advantage. And again, this position was reached in 8 of the games in the database. And now Dr. Euwe plays knight to d8, which the computer does not like. The computer thinks that black should play h6 or king h8 or maybe even queen d8, undeveloping the queen, which is very much not a human move. But Dr. Euwe plays knight to d8, and the engine jumps white's advantage up to about a whole pawn now. So here, white wants to get the bishop out of the way so the knight can come up to c4. The engine suggests the bishop's best squares are d3 or b3. White plays the bishop all the way back to f1. Not his best move, but certainly a reasonable move. The bishop on f1 is not really undeveloped. It's a very long-range piece, and he's no longer blocking castling. He's no longer blocking the king-rook coming out. So you see masters playing the bishop back to f1 a lot more than amateurs because the masters are not afraid of, putting the bishop on f1 where it actually helps guard the king side as well. And it's not really interfering with any of the other pieces anymore, so the coordination is okay. At this point, the engine suggests black should trade in the center, and it says white's best capture is to capture with the knight, and now black should play rook e8, and white retains about his 0.6 advantage. But Dr. Euwe plays another retreating move after bishop f1. He plays knight to e8, and the engine hates that move, says the advantage has jumped all the way up to 2.3. So before, white was much better, but now white, is, if he plays perfectly, is winning. And in the book, Dr. Euwe does criticize his own move and says, better was to play knight to d7, as will be seen before long. The object of the text move is to give the e-pawn effective support by playing f6. So he says knight to d7 is better. The engine agrees, but it also says knight d7 is only the third best move. We just saw the best move was to take the pawn on d4. The second best move was to play c6, so that on knight c4 you can preserve the bishop with something like bishop c7, or maybe even do something, let's take a look here. c6, knight c4. Yes, bishop c7, best move by far. Retaining the bishop, don't let him win the bishop pair. So back to the game, after bishop f1, knight e8, knight c4, white is not only winning the bishop pair, but he's going to threaten a4, a5, and also threaten the e-pawn, which is now attacked 3 times and only guarded twice. And black's going to have a tough time stopping both threats, and in fact it's going to cost him a pawn. And that pawn will be enough to win the game. And white very, very cleverly sees all this. Black plays f6, which is as good a move as any. And white now plays a4, which is also the right idea, threatening to trap the bishop. The problem is if you push a pawn to save the bishop, which you have to do, then when he takes, he'll be able to check on b3 with the queen, and that's going to win a pawn. So that's why Dr. Euwe said a couple moves ago that knight d7 was better than knight e8, because then he wouldn't have to do this. All right, so he plays c6. White says, oh good, let me loosen that pawn on b6 and check you and take that pawn. Queen takes b6. So at this point is the second point in the game where Dr. Euwe gives an analysis of the position. He says, white has an extra pawn, but his king field is weakened by the advance of his h3 pawn to his pawn on h3. Well, that's only a little bit true. And, you know, if you read Logical Chess Move by Move, which is probably the best instructive anthology to start with, Irving Chernev kind of makes the same mistake. He kind of overemphasizes the weakness of that kind of move. And in fact, the engine says that even though black can play g5 here, which is what he does play, that white's completely winning if he plays it well. And it's not even that hard for white to play in terms of, it's not like there's just one line he can play. He has a very flexible position where he has lots of things he can do. And Dr. Euwe says black's plan now is obviously to assault white's kingside with g5 and g4, strengthened possibly with playing knight to f4. And when Dr. Euwe says that, it makes a lot of sense, because when you're down material, it makes sense that you want to play aggressively, because if you play very normally when you're down in material and you give your opponent a chance to just consolidate, then it's very easy for him to trade off all the pieces and just win the endgame. So to go after the white king in this position makes 100% sense. It's just that if white plays perfectly, it's not even going to come close to succeeding. But of course, humans don't play close to perfectly. All right, so in this position, black plays g5, which is the right idea and the right move, but white retains a big advantage. Now the engine suggests white should continue on the queen side with b4, or maybe develop the bishop with bishop e3, or even play a5 with a big advantage. White plays bishop to c4, which actually abandons the king side a little bit. And that pin on the knight is not really much of a problem, because black wants to move his king out of the way anyway. So bishop c4 is a little bit of waste of time, but white still has a very, very big lead, 1.7 according to the Stockfish. All right, so bishop c4, black plays h6. He wants to guard the g-pawn so that he can maybe recapture the e-pawn with his f-pawn in some lines. Also, he wants to stick his king up on h7 in some lines. So black here still losing down 1.9, but has a clear plan to attack on the king side. White plays h4, further weakening his king a little bit. Generally, you don't want to weaken the king on the side your opponent wants to attack. The engine only penalizes white by about 4/10 of a pawn, says he's still up by about 1.5, but probably not necessarily the right idea. In the book, Dr. Euwe doesn't even comment on that move at all. Black gets the king out of the pin and also out of the g-file by playing king h7. And now white should open up the center. An attack on the flank is often best met by a counterattack in the center. Opening up the center with d takes e5 is the right move. White would be ahead by about 2 pawns after that move. Instead, after king h7, white plays h takes g5, allowing black to open up the h-file, which further gives him other attacking chances. And now white's advantage has dropped to 1.3. And Dr. Euwe does criticize that move in the book. He says, this is in conflict with the ideas of the defense. White opens the king-rook file for his opponent, which, is exactly what I just said. So white should be playing in the center and not on the king side where black wants to counterattack. Again, white's still much better, but his lead is dropping, and he has the wrong idea here. So black, of course, takes back to open up the h-file. And now white takes the pawn, but strangely enough, taking the pawn now, which was so good on the previous move, isn't so good anymore. But that's hard for a human to really figure that out. The engine likes a5 with an advantage of about 1.3. After d takes e5 now, which was the best move last move, white's advantage is dropping to 0.7. So black has to take with the d-pawn to let his f-pawn continue to guard the g5 square. And white develops the bishop to e3. White still has the advantage, but it's no longer a winning advantage, and he has to be very careful. Black now plays his best move, rook to h8, getting ready to conduct the kingside attack, and now white has to be very careful about what he wants to do. Engine suggests either queen b4 or bishop f1. White plays g3, which is also okay, third best move according to the engine, and not that much worse than the best move. But again, a little bit dangerous here. If you say, well, that stops the knight going to f4, that's not really true. In the book Pawn Power in Chess, Hans Kamak talks about jumping your knight into f4 in these kind of fianchetto-looking positions, which would sack the knight. And Hans Kamak calls that the Benoni jump. So here the Benoni jump is a little bit in the air as well, but white still has some advantage here. And black gets the king off of the h-file, plays king to g6, and now the only move that gives white an advantage in this position is bishop to f1, which is a hard move psychologically to play because the bishop's already been on f1 a couple times, and to move it back again kind of it's hard for humans to do. So instead, white plays king to g2, and now for the first time in the whole game, the advantage has shifted to black. Now it looks like king g2 is a good move because white can neutralize the h-file with rook to h1 and get both of his rooks connected through the h-file. But black's going to have a way to stop him from doing that. Let's read Dr. Euwe's comment. This is his third mini-plan comment. After king to g2, his assessment is white's king side is seriously weakened, which is now true. And at the moment, black has a preponderance of available forces. That's what I get for reading fast. A preponderance of available forces, but must not wait until white strengthens his defense, say by rook to h1. So he's saying, don't wait for white to play rook h1. You got to do something really fast here. The plan for black is the destruction of white's battlements by the sacrifice of a knight at f4 in order to force an immediate breakthrough by the attacking forces. So black plays knight f4 check, and now white pretty much has to take the knight. He can't really go back because he doesn't have any way of escaping if that knight stays on f4. So he has to take the knight, but should he take it with the pawn or should he take it with the bishop? Well, it turns out there's a gigantic difference. And in the game, Dr. Tartakower, who's playing, it's two doctors playing, Dr. Euwe and Dr. Tartakower. Dr. Tartakower plays g takes, and that's actually, again, a losing move. That brings the evaluation from about even down to minus 2.7. So strangely enough, winning the knight for the pawn is the wrong idea, and taking with the bishop is the way to save the game. And a lot of this doesn't come down to planning anymore. It comes down to very careful analysis. And if grandmasters can make such mistakes, you know, when you only have a couple choices, you can see how difficult it is to try to figure these things out. You know, grandmasters make these mistakes, so, you know, so can us normal people much more easily. All right, so pawn takes is a mistake. And now bishop h6 check, again, cutting off the rooks from trying to come in and save the day. Now, everything that white does here is already losing. White plays king to g3. Now we can take the pawn back and win our piece back by forking the bishop and the king. So black takes, e takes f4 check. At this point, he pretty much has to take with the bishop or else there's a mating pattern. Just to show you what I mean is the only other move is to play king here, and then black would play like queen takes e4 or queen h7, and the engine says mate in 12. Not that we humans are going to find a mate in 12, but Tartakower realizes he has to resack the piece back, so he does. And black doesn't even take the bishop with check. He just plays queen d7, bringing the queen in, threatening queen g4 check, and then queen g2 mate. Obviously, white can't allow that. White plays his best move, knight h2. Now black takes the bishop. King has to head toward the middle. Rook h4 check. And in this position, black is, let's see, down 2 pawns, but the white king is the big factor in the evaluation of the position. White's king safety is just disastrous, and meanwhile, white's pieces are also very discoordinated all over the board, really not helping each other. So king to e3. Here, the engine suggests already rook takes e4 check is the best move by far. Euwe sees that move, but he thinks he can set it up first, so he plays bishop g2, which actually allows white to play f3 as his best defense. But unfortunately, he doesn't play his best defense. He plays knight f3, and now we get Euwe's final mini-plan comment. His mini-plan here is the assessment of the position is white's king is poorly protected and his pieces stand unguarded, while the queen can easily become a victim of a double attack on the king and herself. The plan for black is to eliminate white's defending e-pawn by a sacrifice and afterwards to throw all his forces into the battle. So he does play rook takes e4 check. Now this is the kind of move that a lot of weaker players let's say if you're 1200, you might not play that because you'd say, I'm losing a rook for a pawn, it's not worth it. If you're 1700, you might look at that and say, if that doesn't lead to mate in 2 or 3, I can't do it. But if you're like a master or a grandmaster, then you're saying, okay, does that enable me to bring all my pieces into the game? And does that enable white to consolidate before I can win the material back? And even if it takes me 6, 7, 8, 9 moves, we might not be able to see all those moves ahead, but we can see far enough to see that we're getting everything back and we have a great position and the king is exposed. So Max Euwe, being a former world champion, of course, is quite able to do that. He plays the best move, rook takes c4 check. The engine says the other basic winning move is to pin that knight with rook to h3, which would also win, but it's not as good as rook takes c4 check, which is the best move. White may as well take it. In fact, it's his only legal move. Black plays knight d6 check with an eye of getting that bishop back, and he has discovered attacks if the king goes to the d file. The king does go to d3. He really has no choice. If he goes to e3, then knight takes c4 check, wins the queen already. So he plays king d3, and now black only has one winning move. And it's not to play a hasty move like knight c8 check and hit the queen, because then after queen d4, not only does white save the queen, but the queen comes back into the defensive area. So the right move is queen to f5 check, which of course Max Euwe plays. And now again, king to d2 is impossible, or king e3, because of knight takes c4 check, winning the queen. King e2 runs into moves like queen takes f3 check. So he's kind of forced to play king d4, which he does, which is his best move. But now black can continue the attack with queen moves. He checks with the queen, skewering the king and the bishop. The rook can't go in the way because the knight's guarding that square. The king goes back to d3. Now the best move is to take the knight, probably. He takes the bishop, which lets the king run back to c2, but that's also winning. Again, you don't have to play it perfectly as long as you play it well enough to get a winning position. Now white should play, black should play bishop takes f3 and get his piece back, which he does. Now let's look at the material. If you use the Reinfeld values, pawns 1, knights and bishops 3, rooks 5, queens 9, we see that black has 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, and you might say, oh, the game is even now. Well, the game is more even than it would be if black had played the attack perfectly, which we don't always expect. You know, nobody plays like a computer. But actually, in these kind of positions, not only is a bishop and a knight much better than a rook and a pawn almost always, but also the black king is actually more safe, even though white does have a chance to play a couple checks here, which he does. First he attacks the queen. Little Zwischenzug with the bishop. Bishop checks. King to b2. Now there's no more safe checks. So black just plays queen d3, threatening queen c2 check in some lines. White finally gets a check in. Yay! And you might say, wow, that king is exposed. He has to run around. He plays king f7. Now white could put his queen on c7. A lot of people would do that right away. The problem is, if after king to e6, white doesn't have any more checks, and it really doesn't do him any good. So white decides to stop the queen check on c2. The engine says it doesn't matter what he plays, he's losing, and it says his move of play there is the second best move. The other rook was maybe slightly better. So he plays rook ac1. Black plays queen d2 check. King to a3. If he plays king to a1, let's look at that line. King to a1, the best move is knight to c4. Again, you might say, I can't go there, he just takes the knight. But if you look one move further, you realize he can't. If he takes the knight, that gives you rook takes pawn check, and that's going to be checkmate. So, knight c4, yes, white can save the queen with tempo and play queen c7 check, but after king e6, again, he has no good safe checks. He can bring his rook to the 7th rank, he can pin the bishop, but black's threatening mate over here, and it's very, very difficult to stop that mate. And again, if he takes the knight, rook takes a4 is mate. So this just doesn't work. So black is using his minor pieces and his major pieces together to coordinate very, very well for the attack. So white sees that and plays king to a3. And now black needs to sacrifice a couple pieces to finish off the attack. And again, this is where if you're 1200, you're probably going to not look at any of these moves because they all involve giving up pieces and you're not getting it all back on the next move. If you're 1700, you're probably going to look a lot deeper on this. But if you're a really good player, you can look all the way far enough to see that you're going to win. But you have to keep looking and say, if I do this, what's going to happen? So you fork the king and the queen. Obviously, if he moves the king, you can just take the queen if nothing else. So he has to take the knight. And now you sacrifice the rook. Well, again, he can't move the king. If he plays king to b3, then queen a2 is mate. So he has to take the rook, and then you check him. And he only has one legal move to play king to b4, and you check him again. Well, now white has two legal moves. This has all been forced since we sacked the knight, and we sacked the rook. If he plays king to a5, then queen a3 is checkmate already. And if we play king to c5, then queen takes f2 check, skewers the king and the king has no squares that can move to guard the queen. So you had to look these 4 or 5 moves ahead in order to sacrifice the knight. Let's do that again in slow motion insta replay. Knight checks, forking the king and the queen. The only way to save the queen is to take. Rook checks. The only way to avoid mate is to take. That's 2. Queen checks. The only legal move is king b4. That's 3. Queen checks, that's 4. And finally, if king here, then queen takes f2 check. And now he has to give up the queen. Let's say he plays king d6. Queen takes b6. And black has a queen and a bishop and a extra pass pawn against the 2 rooks. Engine says it's actually mate in 12 already in this position. Okay, so today we talked about plans versus mini plans. Mini plans are more the kind of thing. Dr. Euwe showed one of his own games, gave you 4 mini plans. The last mini plan, of course, involved a checkmate of the white king. And that's more how you want to think of planning in the future is, you know, what do I need to do? Which in the opening, which piece comes next? Where do I want to castle? How do I get all my pieces out? You know, you're not always going for these long-term grandiose plans. Yes, there's some positions that lend itself to that, but less so most positions. All right, hope you enjoyed today's video. Again, if you can tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, that'd be great. You can like the video, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.